There's a country that was once among the 10 richest nations on Earth, with wealth rivaling France and Germany, that has since defaulted on its debt 9 times, suffered hyperinflation repeatedly, and trapped its population in a cycle of economic crisis that repeats every decade like clockwork. That country is Argentina, and its story isn't just tragic national history. It's a laboratory demonstration of how the debt system destroys nations through a predictable pattern: crisis, bailout, recovery, denial, and inevitable collapse. Understanding Argentina isn't about studying one country's failures. It's about seeing the future of every nation that builds its economy on debt, exports, and dependence on global financial systems controlled by the financial elite. The Sabio Observer recognizes Argentina as the clearest example of the debt crisis cycle that threatens all nations participating in the modern economic system. The pattern is so consistent you could set your clock by it. Argentina borrows heavily during boom times, living beyond its means as exports bring foreign currency. Then external conditions shift, global demand falls, commodity prices drop, or interest rates rise, and suddenly Argentina can't service its debt. Crisis erupts. The IMF arrives with bailout loans and austerity conditions. The economy stabilizes temporarily, and politicians declare recovery. Then, within a decade, everyone forgets the last crisis. Borrowing starts again, and the cycle repeats. 9 defaults over a century. 9 times the country promised, "This time is different." 9 times it wasn't, and the 2001 default remains. The most spectacular example of sovereign debt collapse in modern history. 132 billion defaulted in one moment, destroying savings, collapsing the banking system, and impoverishing millions overnight. But here's what makes Argentina's story crucial for understanding the global economy in 2025. The same cycle is playing out now in dozens of countries. The same debt accumulation during boom times, the same external vulnerability, the same eventual crisis when global conditions shift. Argentina is the warning sign that everyone sees but nobody heeds because we always think, "That's Argentina, it won't happen here." Stick with me, and I'll expose exactly how Argentina's cycle works, why 9 defaults haven't taught the lessons that would prevent a 10th, and what this reveals about the inevitable future of debt-based economies everywhere. Ready to see your country's future through Argentina's past? Let's break down the endless economic chaos. Let's start with the historical tragedy that sets up everything. Argentina wasn't always an economic basket case. In the early 20th century, from roughly 1900 to 1930, Argentina was genuinely wealthy, among the 10 richest nations per capita globally. Buenos Aires was called the Paris of South America, not as flattery but as accurate description of its wealth, architecture, and culture. Argentine per capita GDP was comparable to France and Germany. The country was a major exporter of beef, wheat, and other agricultural products that the industrializing world desperately needed. European immigrants poured in, bringing capital, skills, and ambition. Argentina seemed destined to join the ranks of developed nations permanently, but the wealth was built on a fatal vulnerability that the modern economy would exploit repeatedly: export dependence and external financing. Argentina's prosperity relied entirely on global demand for its commodities and on foreign capital investment in its infrastructure and industries. This created a structural trap. When global conditions were favorable, Argentina boomed. But when external conditions shifted, and they always eventually shift, the economy collapsed. The Great Depression of 1929 destroyed global demand for Argentine exports. Commodity prices crashed. Foreign capital fled. And Argentina discovered that wealth built on external factors is wealth you don't actually control. The first default came in 1827, then again in 1890, then 1951, establishing a pattern that would repeat throughout the century. The fundamental mistake Argentina made, the same mistake developing nations continue making, was believing that temporary boom conditions would last forever. During good times, the government borrowed heavily to fund infrastructure, social programs, and political patronage. Private companies borrowed to expand production. Individuals borrowed to consume. Everyone assumed the good times would continue because they couldn't imagine the alternative. This is the denial phase of the cycle. When everything seems fine, questioning sustainability becomes politically toxic. Politicians who warn about debt accumulation are dismissed as pessimists. The financial elite who profit from lending encourage more borrowing. And the population, seeing rising living standards, votes for whoever promises to maintain the boom. But the debt crisis was already being built during the boom, like a time bomb set to explode when external conditions inevitably changed. And change they did, repeatedly, catastrophically. Now let's examine the period that set up Argentina's most spectacular collapse. The military dictatorship from 1976 to 1983 that exploded the country's external debt from $8 billion to $45 billion, a more than five-fold increase in just 7 years. This wasn't productive investment that built lasting economic capacity. This was borrowing for military spending, corruption, subsidies to failing industries, and capital flight by those connected to the regime who saw the crisis coming and got their money out before the collapse. The military government, facing no democratic accountability, borrowed recklessly from international banks eager to recycle petrodollars from oil-producing nations. The banking system created the debt crisis by lending to a regime everyone knew was unsustainable. But the borrowing was enabled by a global economic system that had evolved to trap developing nations in perpetual debt. After the 1973 oil crisis, Western banks were flooded with petrodollars that oil-producing nations deposited with them. These banks needed borrowers, so they aggressively marketed loans to developing countries, including Argentina's military regime. Interest rates were low initially, making the debt seem manageable. But when the U.S. Federal Reserve dramatically raised rates in the early 1980s to fight inflation, dollar-denominated debt became crushing. Argentina's interest payments exploded even as export earnings collapsed due to global recession. This wasn't just Argentine mismanagement. It was a systemic trap where monetary policy in Washington determined the survival of economies thousands of miles away. And the most insidious mechanism was that much of the borrowed money never actually helped Argentina's economy. It went to military spending that produced nothing economically productive, corruption and patronage that enriched the elite, subsidizing failing state enterprises for political reasons, capital flight wealthy Argentines and regime insiders borrowing in pesos, converting to dollars at favorable rates, and depositing the money in foreign banks while the country owed the debt. By the time democracy returned in 1983, Argentina was drowning in unpayable debt, chronic inflation was destroying the currency, and the population bore the burden of debt that had primarily enriched the wealthy and powerful. This created the preconditions for the catastrophic 2001 default that would become a textbook example of how the debt system destroys nations when the cycle reaches its inevitable conclusion. Let's examine Argentina's most spectacular collapse. The 2001 default on $132 billion in sovereign debt, the largest default in history at that time that destroyed the middle class, collapsed the banking system, and proved that the debt cycle always ends in catastrophe no matter how many times politicians promise otherwise. The path to 2001 followed the script perfectly. After crisis in the 1980s, Argentina implemented IMF-demanded reforms in the 1990s. The peso was pegged to the dollar. Inflation was tamed temporarily. Foreign investment flooded in. Growth resumed. Politicians declared victory. Everyone forgot the last crisis and assumed this time was different. But the underlying vulnerabilities remained. Export dependence, dollar-denominated debt, and structural deficits that required continuous borrowing. When the cycle turned again in the late 1990s Brazilian currency crisis, Asian financial crisis contagion, rising U.S. interest rates, falling commodity prices, Argentina couldn't maintain the peso-dollar peg. Capital fled. The government imposed corralito, restrictions on bank withdrawals, trapping people's savings. The banking system froze. The economy contracted 20% in 2 years. Unemployment hit 25%. And finally, in December 2001, Argentina defaulted on $132 billion, converted everyone's dollar-denominated bank accounts to pesos at unfavorable rates, destroying savings, and collapsed into chaos with riots, 5 presidents in 2 weeks, and millions falling into poverty overnight. The human cost was staggering. Middle-class families who had saved for decades saw their wealth evaporate. Retirees on fixed pensions couldn't afford food. Unemployment became permanent for many. The cost of living skyrocketed through currency collapse while wages couldn't keep pace. But here's the most important lesson. After the 2001 crisis, after the worst default in history, after destroying an entire generation's wealth, Argentina repeated the cycle. By 2010, the government was borrowing heavily again. By 2020, Argentina defaulted for the 9th time. The same cycle. the same denial during boom times, the same inevitable crisis when conditions shift. And currently, as of 2025, Argentina is once again restructuring debt, fighting inflation, and setting up the conditions for the 10th default that everyone can see. Coming but nobody in power will acknowledge. This isn't Argentine incompetence. It's the inevitable result of participating in a global debt system where developing nations are structurally vulnerable. Export dependence means your economy is controlled by external demand you can't influence. Dollar-denominated debt means your obligations increase when your currency weakens, creating a death spiral. IMF bailouts come with austerity conditions that deepen recessions, and the financial elite in international banks and Western capitals profit from the cycle, lending during booms, collecting during stable periods, and then profiting again from crisis through buying distressed assets. Argentina is trapped not by its own failures, but by a global economic system designed to extract wealth from the periphery to the core, from developing nations to financial centers, from the many to the financial elite few. And the next crisis is already being set up right now, as we speak. So there's Argentina's story, from top 10 global wealth to 9 defaults in a century, with the most spectacular collapse in history in 2001, and the inevitable setup for the 10th crisis already underway. The cycle of boom, borrowing, denial, and collapse isn't random chaos. It's the predictable outcome of building an economy on exports, external financing, and dollar-denominated debt in a global system controlled by foreign monetary policy and financial institutions that profit from the cycle regardless of the human cost. The question you need to ask is, what does Argentina's endless crisis tell you about every other nation playing the same game? Countries across Latin America, Africa, Eastern Europe, and even developed nations are running the same playbook. Borrowing heavily during boom times, assuming good conditions will last forever, ignoring the warning signs as debt accumulates, and then acting shocked when crisis arrives. The debt crisis isn't coming, it's already here, playing out in slow motion across multiple nations simultaneously. Argentina is just ahead in the cycle, showing everyone else their future. Here's what I need you to do. Look at your country's external debt, its export dependence, and its borrowing trends over the past decade. If debt has grown significantly, if the economy relies on commodity exports or external capital, if politicians are declaring victory and encouraging more borrowing, you're in the denial phase of the Argentina cycle. The crash is coming. Only the timing is uncertain. And if this video showed you that Argentina's chaos isn't unique incompetence, but the inevitable result of the global debt system's design, subscribe to this channel right now. Because Argentina is the warning every nation ignores until it's their turn to collapse. Understanding the cycle is the first step to protecting yourself before the crisis arrives. The 10th default is coming for Argentina. The first default is coming for many others. The only question is, will you see it before it destroys your wealth like it destroyed Argentina's 9 times?